good morning or good afternoon from your sitting room. This is Double XL Season 4 and particularly on the book review. Today I'm going to be talking to the gentleman who is well known to most of you and the gentleman who I would say, in my own opinion, shaped the media landscape in Uganda after the 1986. The gentleman known as Mr. William Pike is on the show today to talk about the book that I think is the greatest book so far at the moment in Uganda. And of course, the book that rhymes most of the books written, telling the story of Uganda before the 1986 and perhaps after the 34 years. William Pike, in his book, talks about some very intimate stuff and as well as some very difficult moments of the history of Uganda and as a country. Let's dive into it. And William, welcome to the show.
Thanks for bringing me on, Eddie.
You're welcome. How are you?
I'm good.
Tell me about your flight from Nairobi to Kampala.
Well, I haven't tried tried Uganda Airlines yet. I must try it. I normally come on Jambo Jet, and it's fine. I come every month to Uganda to check on Capital Radio. Yeah. So I'm still around.
Okay, so you haven't flown Uganda Airlines, but did you fly the Uganda Airlines, original Uganda Airlines?
Flew Uganda Airlines, yes, in the old days.
Yes.
And I think even in the book, there's a story of how when I moved to Uganda, which was in, I think, June 1986. Yeah. So I'd been covering the Bush War before then, but I actually moved and came to work at New Vision full-time in June 1986. Okay. We went on Uganda Airlines Boeing 707 from Gatwick, and then we got all the way over Sudan, and then some part of the plane broke down, so we had to go back to Gatwick.
Whoa.
And
from Sudan?
From Sudan all the way back, which is like 3/4 of the way to Uganda.
Yeah.
And we went all the way back to Gatwick, and it was a pretty, it was more like a matatu than a plane. And I think as that plane that eventually crashed in Rome in, I can't remember when that was, 1989 or 1990. So that's the last time I flew Uganda Airlines. But I look forward to flying the new Ugandan Airlines.
Okay. What do you think of the Ugandan airline of today versus the Ugandan airline of the old days?
Well, it's too early to comment, but my one concern is it's so difficult to make money running an airline. South African Airlines is effectively bankrupt. Kenya Airways, the government Kenya Airlines is requesting the government to nationalize it. Rwanda Air survives on subsidies from the state, substantial subsidies. Ethiopian Airlines is the most profitable and successful African airline. Yeah. Ethiopia is a highly disciplined country, so I don't think you have a problem in Ethiopia of training pilots, yeah, and then they go to work for Emirates. It's a challenge, yeah, and I hope Uganda Airlines succeeds. I'm sure they can succeed with short-haul regional flights. Yeah. The challenge is doing long-haul international flights. That can be very expensive and challenging.
Yes, and I think we're bringing about 3 or 4 planes, to that effect, right? Well, you have heard from William the experience of flying Uganda Airlines back in the days. So let's dive into this very long-awaited 4 moments of the combatants, the memo of the Bush War in Uganda, and the press in Uganda. What a title!
Well, the title comes from the NRA song, which you can find on YouTube if you want to listen to it.
They fought a Bush war, heavy and encouraging, until when the blood was shed for Ugandans. Fellow combatants and patriots in the struggle, our country must be free.
They gave their lives so that Uganda could be free. You know, so it's that you can listen to that song on YouTube, and that's where the song came from.
All right, and so you decided that
That's where the title came
the title of the book came from, and anything particularly that drove you to it?
If you listen to those songs in those days, and I think this is what it's very difficult for people to imagine, even the Bobby Wine followers, it's difficult for them to imagine, but this Bush War struggle was in some ways selfless. It was genuinely patriotic. Of course there were mistakes and flaws, and people are human, so people are not saying they were perfect, but it was genuinely motivated by feelings of sacrifice and patriotism, which is why those songs, something like that song, Fellow Patriots and Combatants in the Struggle, that's why it captures that mood, and so that's why I wanted to use it. And actually, the people who follow Bobby Wine and think we need a change and blah blah, they might actually find that if they knew more about this, the NRA struggle, that they actually somehow identify with it and sympathize with it. It's not so different.
So they are called.
Well, you know, everyone desires a better world, a more progressive society. The conditions, of course, then were terrible. I mean, at least between 1971 and 1986, at least 500,000 Ugandans died. It was a much more terrible time than it is today. So in that sense, you can't compare the Bobby Wine followers with the NRA.
You have had the part that William talks about, the beginning, the title of the book, the song and the struggle and what is going on right now in the country. But William, let's get a little bit more specific to the book itself. Why the book?
What happened was that in around 1988, a British publisher asked me to write a book. And so I submitted the book in around 1991, but it was too detailed about Ugandan politics for the British publisher. And then I submitted it to a local publisher here, but the local publisher wanted to change it. I didn't want to change it very much. So then it sat in a drawer. And then about 3 years ago, I thought, no, it can't just sit in a drawer. So I wrote a final chapter. The first 14 chapters are really about up to 1993 or 92. And I wrote a last chapter about how President Museveni decided to lift term limits, about how I left New Vision, my final thoughts on the Bush War, was it worth it? To what extent had Uganda been transformed? There was a question when we were in the book, there's a theme. The first time I went to visit Uganda was in the Luwero Triangle, when the Bush War was at its murderous height. The second time I went to visit was the so-called liberated zone in western Uganda. And in Masaka, I stayed with the headquarters of Salim Saleh. And then one day we were driving, he was taking me we were going to see something, he was showing something. And as we were driving along at Murum Road somewhere, Saleh said, "Is this a revolution? You know, this is the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution." So I was a bit nonplussed and struggled to answer the question. But actually, I tell that story at the beginning of my chapter on Western Uganda, the liberated zone in 1985. And then at the very end of the book, I come to answer the question, which in my view, it was a revolution, but not like the Bolshevik revolution in 1917 in Russia, but more like there was some revolutions in 1848 in Europe, which were essentially middle-class revolutions. And they restored the rights of human rights and voting rights and property rights. and stabilize society without radically transforming society. And so I said, yes, I think it was a revolution, but that kind of revolution, like the 1848 revolutions in Europe. So, you know, Uganda is transformed, and Uganda is a better place now as a result of what happened in the Bush War, in my view.
So, you say that moment with Salim Saleh, and a question comes to mind. What drove you from, first of all, how did you even how did you get to be in Uganda and to be in the middle of this war, and from a journalist who was doing his stuff in the UK to get into Uganda and finding yourself to the bush? What was the interest?
I also explain the circuitous path that led me to Uganda in the book. But I was born in Tanganyika, as it was then, in 1952, where my father was a colonial officer. And then when I was older, we went back to England, and I went to school in England. But I always retained, you know, a feeling or something for Africa. And then in my 20s, when I became a journalist, if you're a journalist, it's always much better to write about something that interests you and which you have, where you want to develop a deep understanding. So I started writing about Africa. Then I went to be a foreign correspondent in Tanzania in 1982. And Tanzania at that time was also in a very hopeless economic state. And it was rather depressing. And it was very difficult to work or live in Tanzania in those days. So I came back to the UK and went to do a master's in African Studies at the School of Oriental and Africa Studies. And there I met a mature PhD student who happened to be a Ugandan exile called Ben Matogo. And we started talking, and I was telling him about Tanzania, and he talked about the problems of Africa. And then it turned out he was the London representative of the NRA, NRM.
You didn't know about this?
No, I didn't. No, he was just a guy. It was just like, I'm having a coffee in the coffee bar. This guy's having a coffee there. Hi, how are you? Get chatting. Then we used to meet up in the coffee bar. So it became a personal relationship, and then I discovered these things. And then to cut a long story short, journalists always want to get a big story. There was all these rumors of atrocities in the Luwero Triangle. There was a so-called guerrilla group, or were they bandits? It was a big story. No one knew exactly what was going on. So other journalists were also trying to go, but eventually I ended up being the journalist that was taken to the bush by the NRA, which was, I think, looking back, the greatest formative experience of my life.
And tell me about your first experience meeting President Yoweri Museveni.
Well, to get to see Museveni was a real struggle, because I got a phone call one day in London. Come to Nairobi now. I said, I can't come now, but I'll be there in a week. So I got to Nairobi, met Katagaya. Katagaya sent me to Entebbe, stay in the Lake Victoria Hotel. Someone will come and greet you and say, are you EK's friend? So Aston Kajara came and said, are you EK's friend? I said, yes. Then it took a week to get me into the bush, through a lot of hassles, getting caught in roadblocks. The younger generation won't remember what it was like, but it was super dangerous in Kampala. Much more dangerous being in Kampala than being in the bush with the NRA. No one was outside after 6 o'clock. Everyone was in. If you were outside after 6 o'clock, you were a security operative or something, an army person. It was really scary, incredibly dangerous. Eventually, they decided I had to walk out, because it wasn't possible to drive me out because of all the difficulties. A guy called Bob Kagoro, who was the manager of Total, was the head of the cell that was taking care of me, the 3-man cell. So
Yeah.
I stayed at his house in Kasubi. And then one night we walked out from Kasubi, walked through the dark, walked to Nansana, where there was a little camp,
Yeah.
NRA camp hidden in a coffee bush, picked up 5 NRA people. I walked out with one person,
Yeah.
picked up 5 guys in Nansana. Then from there we walked to what was called Black Bomber Camp, which was commanded by Chaligonza.
This is the current Matayo Chaligonza,
yes.
the
The
cantankerous old
one-
man, yes.
the man with problems on his cigarette.
Yes.
So he's a tough guy.
Yeah.
So he was the commander of the.
Was it tough then?
Well, he was
William?
commanding the nearest NRA camp. I mean, this was a camp with hundreds of soldiers, or very near Matuga in a forest. So that's close. That's the front line.
Yes.
So then we picked up another. So we got there at about 10 o'clock in the morning. Then they let me sleep till about 3 or 4 o'clock. Then they woke me up. I was staying in one of these tents they call Mamengina, Ingia, Pole Pole.
Yes.
Tents in a little grass shelter. Then we walked from there to a big camp called Mondlan, commanded by Tinyafuza.
This is the current Sejusa, David Sejusa.
Yes. Sejusa, yes.
Okay.
But he wasn't called that then. And that was a big camp with maybe 1,000 men. Stayed there for a bit, then continued walking through the night. All of this time, from Black Bomber, the Matuga camp. So there was, in Black Bomber, we picked up 30 soldiers,
Yes.
so like a whole platoon to protect me.
Okay.
But there was one person who took care of me personally, who was Kale Kayahura,
Oh.
who was also called Edward in those days.
Yes.
So, and in the dark, so we walked all through, the second night we walked all through the night, going through ruined buildings, through matoke plantations. And because I was used to living in the city, in London,
Yes.
my night vision was very poor. So I walked for kilometers and kilometers, holding
Kale.
Kale's hand like a little child.
Wow.
And then I got very, very, very tired. And I kept saying, when are we getting there? When are we getting there? He said, oh, no, we'll soon get there. We'll soon get there. So then we walked on, and then we got out of the forested part of Luwero and into the grasslands in Bulamezi. So something like, so after about 2 days,
Yes.
just almost 2 days, we reached Museveni's camp, the headquarters of Mobile Brigade, having walked something like 110 kilometers.
Yes.
And I was wrecked. And then the next morning, they took me to see Museveni.
All right. So tell me something. In the book, you happen to be the first journalist, if I'm not mistaken, and foreign journalist to ever see Museveni in his camp.
Yeah, I think that's, there was actually another journalist who went in. So there were 3 journalists who visited the NRA in the bush. Actually 4 journalists, I think. The first one was called Tom Lansner, who was the Reuters correspondent, and he's still a friend of mine. He was an American journalist.
Okay.
And he went just to the Matuga area with Katagaya in about September 1981, very soon up. But they just hid in the bushes and they didn't really do very much, but they were very small. At that time, there were probably only 100 or 200 soldiers in the NRA. It was a tiny group. Then in 1982, the NRA overexpanded with hindsight and created a liberated zone in Luwero. But that, if you follow the law of guerrilla warfare, you shouldn't take territory that you can't defend.
Yes.
And they tried to set up a liberated zone, and that was actually a disaster because it allowed the UNLA to attack fixed positions.
Yes.
And the NRA didn't, suffered a lot of setbacks at that period. But a journalist called Hans Germani from Germany went to that liberated zone, or that controlled area,
Yeah.
whatever you call it,
Yeah.
at that time. But he never really did a proper write-up of it. So although he went, people don't really know about it.
Yes.
Then I went there in 84, July, August 84. And then in 1985, after they opened the second front in the Ruwenzori Mountains, Tim Cooper and Alison Porteous, who are still around Uganda sometimes, they went and did some TV programs in, I think at the end of 85, end of 84, beginning of 85.
Yes.
So those are the only journalists who ever properly visited NRA in the bush.
But they never met Museveni particularly.
No, I don't think they did. No, they didn't do interviews and all of that stuff with Museveni.
Okay, so let's talk about you meeting Museveni at that point. But point for you to actually note is that 1984, I was, I think, 2 years old or 1 year old or something like that. So you can imagine the contrast when I sit to actually interview William right now. And this is a story of so many Ugandans as well. So William, meeting Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, the fearless man, for the first time, what was running in your mind at that moment when you appeared and said, finally I'm here and this is Museveni, the guy I've been looking for?
Of course it was very exciting because actually that was the journey. You're picking up information about the NRA, but...
You found it exciting, William? Not scared?
Scared and being exciting, I mean, two sides of the same coin. Really.
Yes, yes.
Obviously, as a journalist, to
Yes.
get the interview Museveni was a big thing, and it would be a centerpiece of any article that I wrote in the British papers. Because I'd come there to write this story for the Observer newspaper, which is a Sunday newspaper, one of the two big Sunday newspapers in England.
Yeah.
And so I was very excited. I got a bit irritated because I'd gone all the way this way with them. Then they were taking me to meet Museveni, and they started patting me, checking my bags. I thought, why are they doing this?
I mean, I've been with you all this time.
Anyway, there was a bit of, so we went through that bit of security. Of course, nothing like the security Museveni has today.
Yeah.
And so then that must have been about maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. So Museveni was sitting outside so all the soldiers stayed in little grass thatch.
Mama ingia pole pole.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But his was bigger, and it had more like a hut with straight walls.
Yes.
So, because he was the commander-in-chief.
Chief, yes.
And, or actually not, what he was called then is chairman of the High Command.
Okay.
And so he had a little stick bench, made of sticks lashed together outside his hut. And there was one for me to sit on, and then there were a couple of other benches, I think, where he used to meet his commanders. So I got there, got out my tape recorder, got ready to interview him. And then he said, no, hold on. Tell me about yourself.
Typical President Museveni, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So he's really, in many ways, he hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And so then we did that, and then I did my interviews, which went on for many hours. So I stayed with him until maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening.
Wow, from 10 o'clock.
In the morning, yeah.
Wow.
So we did lots of interviews, but then after we started talking about, so he told me about his history, who he was, the NRA struggle, politics, blah, blah. Saying he was completely confident. That was the very striking thing at the time. He said, if we had 3,000 rifles, I can't remember the exact numbers, it's in the book, 3,000 more rifles, AK-47s, 1 million rounds of ammunition, and some mortar shells, we could capture power immediately.
Wow.
And when he said it, he wasn't really boasting. Sometimes people say, I'm the greatest person.
Yeah.
But when he said it, you felt, actually, somehow, this sounds true or plausible.
Yes.
Actually, and it was that self-confidence, that incredible self-confidence, which is based, I think, on it was based on a profound understanding of the political conditions inside Uganda at that time, plus his understanding of military tactics and strategy.
Yes.
So it wasn't a wild boast. I think it was a reasonable assessment.
Okay.
Because indeed, it was only a year and a half later that he did capture power, so there wasn't such a big gap.
Okay.
But anyway, I did the interview, talked to him for a long time. All the time he was there, he had a second person to cross-check, I think, what I was saying, and so he could discuss, what did you think of that person, Pike?
Oh.
Do you think he's genuine?
Yes.
So the other person...
So there was a person doing a personality
so the other
check.
person was sitting there with his cap pulled over his head.
Yes.
So Museveni was on his bench, and then this person was sitting with his back to a tree, like this, with his cap over his head, so you couldn't see his face. Or when I took pictures, his face wouldn't be showing.
Yes.
And that was Mugisha Muntu.
Wow.
Who was
Yes,
sort of blue-eyed boy.
Yes, and then the fact-finding,
He was
yes.
very close and was doing intelligence stuff for
yes,
Museveni.
yes.
The reason he was hiding his face was he didn't want his family to get in trouble. And as you know, his family were prominent UPC people
Yes.
in Bushenyi.
Yes.
So he wasn't being secretive, he was just trying to protect his family.
Okay.
So, and then I got into a very long argument with Museveni, because at that time I was for a magazine called South in London.
Yes.
So I was doing a lot on business and how to run economies in developing countries. And Museveni had this idea for an exchange rate with 16 different rates.
Yes.
for the Uganda shilling.
Yes.
If you're importing a wig or cosmetics, you pay you get a bad exchange rate. If you're buying a car, you get a bad exchange rate. But if you're importing essentials, you get a good exchange rate. And I was saying to him, this is unworkable because you know, how do you regulate it? And it's much better just to have a single exchange rate and then put a tax on wigs and cars.
Yes.
Anyway, he's very argumentative, Museveni, and he will never admit he's wrong. And then, not on this case, but on other cases later, after I came to Uganda, I found often you'd argue with him, and then a few days later, you'd hear him having changed his position on something. So he internalizes it.
Yes.
But anyway, what I realized...
Which is actually a good thing for a leader, to always take in information and internalize it.
Yes.
And make changes.
Yes.
Because if you just stuck to it and you don't change, you tend to have a problem. Yes.
So I realized, and the following day I also spent a good part of that day with him. So that day and a half I spent with Museveni, eating with him, talking with him, spending time with him, I realized he was really a remarkable person with a very powerful intellect and a very interesting vision of what could happen in Uganda and how Uganda could be reformed and rebuilt.
Yes. He had quite a very interesting ideas on how you can inform Uganda and take Uganda, reform Uganda and take Uganda to forward. What did you pick from Museveni at that point? Was he real about this stuff?
Yeah, very real. But I think the big thing I picked from him at that time was, I think when he was at Dar es Salaam University, he was a Marxist. But by 1984, he'd moved to the idea of a mixed economy.
Okay.
With, you know, capitalist elements, but also elements to protect ordinary people and ordinary Ugandans, so that you incentivize investors, but also try and raise the living standards of the people. So he'd moved to that idea of a mixed economy. And I was asking him, you know, people say you were a Marxist, and at that time the British Foreign Office in England had been trying to find out how left-wing Museveni was, and he said, look, I don't put me in those categories. I'll do a deal with the devil if it makes Uganda a better place. So he was really, I mean, he was that was thing that many people in Europe, the British government was very frightened of Museveni because he thought that he was a left-wing person who was going to nationalise all their businesses, their remaining businesses. And he was saying, no, that's not what I am. So that was also an important thing to discover at that time.
Yes. How did you, what happened after that? Did you, in the book you say that...
Well, so what happened, one thing that happened after that, what happened after that, because I'd walked for 110 kilometers in 2 days, and I hadn't come with proper walking shoes, because I didn't want, when I was going through immigration at Entebbe, to look like I wanted to look like an ordinary tourist, so I just had ordinary shoes. My feet had got very, very swollen, so my ankles were like this. If that's my ankle, it's my ankle's swollen up. Yes. So Museveni got me the doctor for Mobile Brigade to come and treat, and I got one of their precious bandages. They didn't have enough medical materials to reduce the swelling. Yes. So that doctor who reduced the swelling on my ankles was Kizza Besigye. So that's also in the book. Yes. So what happened after the interview is Museveni said, okay, it's time for you to go. Now, how do you think you've got the strength to walk back with your bag legs? We could put you in a stretcher. I said, no, I can't go in the stretcher.
So put you in a stretcher so that people can carry you?
Yeah. I said, no, that would be too humiliating. Yeah. And actually, no, I can manage, I can walk. Then we set off at about 7 o'clock in the evening. I don't know if viewers have seen the picture of Museveni standing in tall grass with an AK-47 on his shoulder, strap on his shoulder and a t-shirt. Yeah.
We actually have that on the show. I think it's going to be the scene, yes.
Yeah, so that picture I took about 1 minute before we set off walking back from Bulamezi to Kampala.
Tell me something, having seen Museveni and done this interview, and now you seem to have a lot more information about the guy who was the mystery guy, but now no more a mystery person. What happened to the story? What did you do to the story?
So then we set off from Bulamezi, walked back to Kampala, but it took, we went back at a slower pace than the pace at which we had rushed to meet Museveni. Saw a lot of evidence of massacres. There were two things I wanted to do on this trip. One is to, as a journalist, I wanted to meet Museveni, get an interview with him. But then second was to see evidence of massacres. And unfortunately, or fortunately from a journalistic point of view, I saw a lot of evidence. Thousands and thousands of skeletons, and there was overwhelming. There weren't many people in Luwero. I mean, there were maybe hundreds of people left in the northern part of, north of Luwero, but in the southern part of Luwero, it was, Matuga and all those areas, Muto, it was completely deserted. But in places like Kapeka, Matuga, Samuto, I saw so many skeletons and dead bodies. It was really tragic, and it made it very plausible that hundreds of thousands of people have died there. I think the American government estimated 150,000 people had died. Yeah. So, but I thought maybe from what I could see it was even more. And the few people that were remaining there were unanimous that it was the government army, the UNLA soldiers that had done it. Because I think there's still a dispute today, were some of those people killed by the NRA? Yeah. But actually, on my trip, I was completely confident that this was all done by the UNLA. Yeah. And for instance, I met one chap who was a survivor. The story is in the book. Yes. And I think you can show the picture.
Yes, Mugerwa.
Edward Mugerwa, I think his name was. Yeah, he had a big scar on his head. Yes. And he wasn't completely normal. He's someone who's had a car crash and had head injury. He didn't talk very clearly, or he talked very slowly. But his story was that he'd been arrested on the street in Kampala, just in the Pandagari operation where they grab random people took him to McKinley barracks, interrogated, then taken to Bombo barracks, then from Bombo barracks loaded onto a lorry and driven into the bush. And in the bush, as they got out of, there was about maybe 20 people in the lorry. As they got out, they were chopped on the back of the head with a panga. Chop, that's why he had a big chop. But in his case, the chop hadn't killed him, but then he got dead bodies thrown on him.
Whoa.
And he woke up and he was still alive, but everyone else was dead. And then he crawled away, and he was found actually in Chalagonza. He was in Chalagonza's camp, a black bomber. Then I asked, I said, can you take me to the place where you were dumped? You know, because you're trying to fact check.
Yes, of course.
You know, here's a story, but is it true?
Yeah.
So he took me to, with the guerrillas, they managed to find the place, and there was a pile of bodies, and every body
And a cut on the head.
a panga cut in the back of the head, which was evidence that his story was credible.
Okay.
That's the pictures and the story. That story is in the book. So
Yes.
we got all that dimension on the return journey to Kampala. Then you were asking about what happened to all the documents.
Yes.
Those were driven by, I was also very frightened now, because I had pages of notes,
Yes.
which I'd written in tiny handwriting
Yes.
to minimize the amount of paper.
Yes.
But I still had pages and pages, plus 6 rolls of camera film.
Whoa.
Because in those days we didn't have digital cameras,
Yes.
you had to have physical film.
Yes.
Plus, I think 3 cassette tapes of Ms. 70 talking.
Of audio. Yes.
Yeah, if I'd been caught with those, I would also have been killed.
Yes.
So those were handed over to Dr. Makumbi at Mulago Hospital, who was later the health minister
Yeah.
in NRM government. And he drove them to Nairobi and handed them over to Katagaya. And then Katagaya sent them by DHL to London. And then I got scared because by that time I'd been back in England for a month. And after taking all these risks, all my material for my story
We're not with you.
not
So,
with you, and I
yeah.
thought, shit, what am I going to do? Excuse
Yeah.
my language.
Yes.
If I lose it, everything will be wasted. Even the risks that the NRA took will have been wasted.
Yeah.
But fortunately it came. I wrote the story for The Observer. It became a big international story for various reasons and was splashed on newspapers all over the world. Bote called a cabinet meeting. How did this happen? They arrested the immigration officer who let me in and said, why did you let this man in? The immigration officer, I didn't know, he's just a tourist.
Yes.
And actually, when I came back in January 1986, just after the capture of power,
Yeah.
he actually stamped my passport and told me that story. And he said, but don't worry, everything's okay.
It's
now."
okay now, yes. So that story actually is quite key for me right now because you have set so many people, including the British government, in the story. I got my hand on that whole story of the British government talked about a certain number of people who are dead, and it seems like your story brought out some dimensions that had to make people rethink the position of the killing in Uganda during the wartime and all that stuff.
So what it was that the British government, it was actually a big controversy at that time as Amnesty International, the International Red Cross had released figures saying a lot of people were being killed because there were displaced people's camps.
Yes.
The biggest one was in Kapeka, and they were saying people were being taken out of the camps at night and killed. And then the British government issued a statement in around July 1984, around the time, actually or August 1984, saying, it was the American government issued a statement saying 150,000 people had died in Luwero in this violence, primarily at the hands of the government army. The British government said nonsense, it's only 12,000 at the most.
Yes.
It's happening, yes, but not more than 12,000. So then I came back with evidence then, and I said, actually, not only is the British government wrong, but probably the American government is underestimating on the basis of what I've seen.
Yes.
So that's one reason why this became a global story. Because if you think of all the stuff about the Rohingya Muslims in Bangladesh now, that's a huge thing.
Yes.
Uganda was occupying a similar place in the world media in those days.
Yeah.
And if someone could come and quantify accurately how many Rohingya Muslims had been killed,
Yeah.
now it would be a big story. So it was something like that. That's why it became a big story when I said, actually, no, there's evidence that it's even more than 150,000.
Yes, and so in that story, you account for that moment when you jump on your bicycle to ride to, I think, the university canteen or something like that, and then the newspaper finally arrived to the man who made the connection, Mr. Ben Matogo. What happened? What was the feeling?
You know, I used to ride a bicycle when I was in London, so I rode to the Observer newspaper on Saturday night, the night before it was coming out, and the story was coming out. And they gave me some copies of the paper. Then I went to Ben Matogo's. He lived in a council flat in Kentish Town in London, for people who know London. Yeah. And I sat on his balcony, it was the summer, and I read out the story aloud.
I enjoyed that moment of you kind of reading the story loud so that this guy can hear. Yeah.
And then he rang all the Ugandans in England saying, no, make certain you buy the Observer tomorrow. And that actually was something, it was, I think, a kind of turning point in Uganda history in a way, because it changed the narrative from being a fringe bandits. Are they bandits, as Obote says? Are they just a few guys running around in the bush? Actually, no, it's an organized guerrilla army with a vision and a strategy. They're disciplined, they're committed. So the whole perspective on the NRA changed, and externally, not obviously internally, and externally, I think even Ugandans in England, for instance, started becoming much more supportive or believing much more in what was going on. So it was somehow a propaganda turning point for the NRA.
All right. So Ollie, right there, we're going on to a break, and when we come back, William Pike, Mr. William Pike, will be answering about 2 or 3 more questions about his story and what happened, and of course, how did he end up back in Uganda and New Vision, and what happened after New Vision.